Should I tell you a little bit about Satan? That in the court of heaven, Satan is the district attorney. He is not, as Christians imagine, the enemy of heaven and the enemy of mankind. He's merely the person who sees the bad side of things and carries out the dirty work.
Something that I find repulsive about especially monotheistic messianic religion. With a large part of itself, it quite clearly wants us all to die.
A new consciousness is developing which sees the Earth as a single organism and recognizes that an organism at war with itself is doomed.
Welcome to Deferred Gnosis. We live in a world of gnosis deferred. The primary purpose of Deferred Gnosis is to bring together contrasting perspectives that relentlessly investigate the whys and wherefores most are unwilling to explore.
We will grasp those fleeting eternal truths necessary to liberate us from the shackles of sedentary belief. We will sharpen reason against the whetstone of radical thought.
Hello again. Welcome to episode 2 of the Deferred Gnosis podcast. It is certainly good to be here. Matt, how are you? How have things been?
I'm doing fantastically, Shay. Yeah, things have been good.
Excellent.
Things have been good, thanks. How about yourself?
Well, it's been great. After the first episode,
we've been getting a lot of good feedback, a lot of comments. And,
absolutely, people have been sending messages. We've had a discussion going, and I have to say, I love every bit of it. Keep it coming. Keep the interaction coming, the discussion.
Lots of
this
good
is
discussion.
What Deferred Gnosis is all about. Thank you guys so much.
Definitely. Yep.
Yeah, so I'm excited. We're gonna have our first artist interview after our discussion. At the end of the show. Well, not
Fantastic.
At the end of the show, but towards the end of our discussion, we're going to have Grypt. My good friends, Romak is going to be on. She's going to talk about the band. We're going to preview a clip. So I'm really excited about that. But let's get things started. We touched a little bit on Satanism. I kind of gave hints as to how I subscribe to it, the manner in which I subscribe to it. But I mentioned that it could be secular. It could be atheistic. Satanists run the gamut.
Yeah, so I've known quite a few Satanists in my personal life, and what I notice is Satanism can
Myself
mean...
included, of course.
Oh, yeah.
I'm one of them.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent.
Yeah, of course
Nice.
you are.
Okay,
naturally.
okay, all right. Just want to make sure.
Yeah. And some mutual friends of ours that that we know. So
excellent. Yeah.
And what I notice is that Satanism certainly means it definitely seems to mean different things to different people. It's like Satanism doesn't have a unified definition that all Satanists agree upon.
Absolutely. I mean, when you say Satanists, you have to explain yourself. I mean, I've made a life of explaining. Well,
your particular breed of Satanism.
Once I got out of adolescence, I gave up explaining myself to people who weren't aware. I just either don't mention it or it comes up. But even amongst Satanists, you have to kind of explain. A lot of the time, you kind of have to explain where you come from in your beliefs. You got to give a subset of definition. And but this is especially poignant because considering the climate right now, the satanic activism going on, Satanism is in the limelight. I think it's now more important than ever that we dig into it and we get a kind of an understanding as solid as possible on what is going on with Satanism. What are the underlying understanding? What is the current? Digging into it and seeing what the current view is, and then figuring out and disseminating that, deconstructing that, and figuring out the main ideas.
So I think we need a foundation, a platform, a viable source from which to concretely define Satanism.
Definitely. And although some will disagree with us, the first place to start, I believe, is Anton LaVey.
Right, the Satanic Bible. Yep.
The Church of Satan at the time, and kind of his ideas. I mean, because before that, modern Satanism didn't really catch on in any...
Didn't have like a centralized identity, a congealing...
Sure. You didn't have any mainstream publication that really concretized or galvanized the idea.
Right.
So it's fair to say, and it's not just in my personal experience, I was exposed
That's
to LaVey.
been the case for you, for sure.
Sure,
right.
Sure. And a lot of Satanists I know. But besides personal experience, you have one, James R. Lewis, who did a census back in 2001, and he later did a second and a third one in 2011, 2010, 2011. And he kind of did a census. He kind of gathered Satanists from different organizations, all the mainstream ones, a questionnaire, and kind of seeking to, I think for the first time, is fair to say, as I understand, to kind of get some ideas about how Satanists identified. And one of the primary... And those statistics we're going to go into in a bit later. There's some statistics there, and
specific
I think they're going to be
numbers,
important.
right?
But we're going to touch on that in a bit, in a minute. But one of the important ideas is that regardless of how Satanists identified, whether it was
kind of more atheistic or more
secular,
spiritual,
philosophical, religious,
right.
One of the main currents was that Anton LaVey, that was their first exposure, and even if they didn't identify directly with LaVey, Anton LaVey was in their beliefs.
He's influential,
their ideas.
right?
Some of the concepts of magic, some of the concepts of Satan, definitely influenced by LaVey, even though they chose to eschew LaVey personally as a person or iconic figure.
Right.
And again, some are going to disagree with us. There's some who identify with the literary figures or the philosophical figures that inspired LaVey. Baudelaire, Shelley,
Redbeard,
Byron, Redbeard for sure, Ayn Rand, Objectivism, Samuel Clemens, the whole, I mean, all the figures that inspired LaVey, they choose to use those as pre-LaVeyan sources to their religious or their philosophical, quote-unquote, identity. And there's some, and if you go from LaVey towards other satanic figures, self-identified, it only gets more spiritual. Because I think, in effect, what we want to do is figure out, is Satanism secular? Is it atheistic? And what kind of atheism is it? I mean, that's one of the main goals to what we want to do. If you move from LaVey towards the literary figures, sure, it can become more secular if you're using that as a philosophical standpoint. But moving from LaVey to other satanic figures, I mean, it only gets more spiritual.
Right.
It only gets more theistic in a vast majority of the circumstances. So let's start with LaVey. In my personal experience, I remember picking up the satanic rituals for the first time in Borders. And I remember reading the intro, and it said, rites of Lucifer, on the altar of the devil, up is down, pleasure is pain. I remember that inspiring me.
Right.
LaVey was a big deal.
Very powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a big deal. And then it kind of started me on my path and reading up the Satanic Bible, and a few months later. And it started my path. So let's start with that. And my impressions when I first read the Satanic Bible the first few times, there was some solid ideas. There were some atheist ideas. I mean, you do have the ideas of self-deification.
Right.
You do have the ideas of yourself as God. You know, one of the Satanic statements says spiritual pipe dreams. You know, it talks about spirituality. Carnality is what it celebrated. It talked about celebrating carnality. It does have some atheistic ideas.
Very down to earth.
Does kind of talk
in some regards.
Sure, it does kind of talk about Satan as a symbol. But then again, you add half the book was magic. I mean,
yeah, half the book is rituals, and very specifically defining how these rituals are to be carried out, and really defining what you're actually doing. I mean, he's talking about dark forces and conjuring demons. Yeah, and I think we should at this point maybe dig directly from the source. Sure.
Yeah.
So
good. I think in this satanic, how Satan is viewed. Let's look at that first. So amongst Satanists, how Satan is viewed according to LaVeyan Satanism. Some of the mentions. He talks about him being as a symbol. He talks about the self. He talks about carnality. But here's a quote, and this kind of nods to an idea, but I'll just read it and then we can reflect. This is actually from Burton Wolfe, who did the intro for the Satanic Bible in several versions of the Satanic Bible, but did the intro during certain periods. He also wrote The Devil's Avenger, which was the first biography of LaVey. And he says this. He's talking about the magic circle of LaVey. The major purpose of the circle was to meet for the performance of black rituals that LaVey had discovered. He had accumulated a library of works that described the Black Mass and other pagan ceremonies conducted by groups such as the Knights Templar in 14th century France and the Golden Dawn in 19th century England. The original intent of these black orders was to blaspheme, mock the Christian church, and address themselves to the devil as an anthropomorphic deity that represented the reverse of God. In LaVey's view, the devil was much more than that. Satan represented a dark, hidden force in nature that was responsible for the workings of earthly affairs for which science and religion had no explanation and no control. Now, moving a little bit forward, he says, "At first I detected the force in small ways," LaVey explains. "It might be the discovery of an individual whose powers of wishing were so great that he could win horse races. In my case, I found I could conjure up parking places at the last minute in front of theaters, which none should have been there. I also discovered the ability through magic to bring reversals to enemies and gain advantages for myself. I realized I had stumbled onto something, and I would have gone on doing it on my own without any magic circle, but I also realized that for some things, private magic was weaker than mass ritual magic." So
here we have, LaVey in that quote is talking about winning horse races. Using this magic.
So
dark
there's an
force.
effect on the outside world.
Yeah,
there's a conscious effort. There's also a mention of describing Satan as a force,
and even as an anthropomorphic being.
No, that was saying that those old groups, like the Nice Time, they address Satan as an anthropomorphic deity. Let's go on a little further. Here's another thing, and this is in the same intro.
Okay.
"For one thing," LaVey explains, "calling it a church enabled me to follow the magic formula of 9 parts outrage and 1 part social respectability that is needed for success. But the main purpose was to gather a group of like-minded individuals together for use of their combined energies, calling up the dark force in nature that is called Satan."
So Satan here is being defined as a dark force in nature.
It's almost like a pantheistic.
Yeah, right, and it's a force through.
Pantheistic, not as an idea of like divine in all things, like a divine energy that runs in all things. Not in the, I guess, extra traditional or very traditional sense, but pantheistic in a way that of forces and that almost embodying it in a certain way, though.
Right, yeah. So pantheism meaning that there's basically a force of nature, not that divinity is in all things, but just that a force. Basically,
it can be called on in conscious effort.
Right, yeah. So, from a perfectly secular standpoint, you would call this supernatural, but pantheism would refer to this kind of force as being part of the natural order.
So at this point, atheism.
Right. So, actually, at this point, pantheism and atheism are congruent. They're the same thing as they relate to Satanism. There's nothing about atheism which is in conflict with dark forces of nature. Now we're using a very specific definition of atheism. Actually, we're using the technical definition of atheism, which differs significantly from what I feel is the colloquial definition of atheism, which is often conflated to mean secular atheism.
Okay.
Atheism is not necessarily secular. And again...
And we're going to go into that. Maybe we'll go into that a little bit later.
Sure.
Yeah,
okay.
I think we'll get into that. We can maybe dig into that exact definition. But for right now, we could say on a technical level...
Satanism is at least pantheistic.
But it can be atheistic too. Atheistic. LaVey has some pantheistic ideas. Maybe. Let's look a little further, I think, and see where this is going. Let's just take it exactly from his words, and defying Satan. So, this is from the Satanic Bible. So most Satanists, and this is in the section "Hell, the Devil, How to Sell Your Soul." Most Satanists do not accept Satan as an anthropomorphic being with cloven hooves, a barbed tail, and horns. He merely represents a force in nature, the powers of darkness, which have been named just that because no religion has taken these forces out of the darkness, nor has science been able to apply technical terminology to this force. It is an untapped reservoir that few can make use of because they lack the ability to use a tool without having to first break down and label all the parts which make it run. It is this incessant need to analyze which prohibits most people from taking advantage of this many-faceted key to the unknown, which the Satanist chooses to call Satan.
Wow. Yeah, so here we have more affirmation
I mean, he says it transcends religion and science.
Right.
So it's science that hasn't been discovered yet. I mean, that's kind of like what that implies there. Science has no way of defining it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, so you think it's fair to say LaVey is at least leans towards pantheism at this point?
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, just given these quotes so far, that's...
At least in defining what Satan is. Yeah,
right.
sure, he's a symbol, sure, he's a metaphor, but he's not a metaphor.
We have here LaVey defining Satan as a dark force of nature that is, as you said, consciously called upon to affect change in the real world. This is magic.
You call that,
this is magic. This is
sure.
supernatural. This is pantheism.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And there's a little-known monograph. So this was, I want to get another quote. Not to hit you guys too many with many quotes, but I mean, we have to hit every part of this. We have to, we have to dig into this and all points of view. And once again, we mentioned the carnality parts, the symbol, Satan as a symbol, Satan as a metaphor, Satan as a literary figure that of liberation and self-deification. We mention all that, but we're really getting into the quote-unquote theology. I have to put that in quotes.
Yeah. Play it safe, Shay.
Yeah.
Quote that shit. Put that fucker in quotes, would you?
Absolutely. Here's from a monograph. This is the... This is what LaVey kind of released before the Satanic Bible. This is actually the precursor of the Satanic Bible.
Okay.
I don't think this is invalid to use. I mean, this is his own words at the time, 1967, 1968. This is before the Satanic Bible was released in 69. And this is a quote from that. This is in the...
Well, the church by then was created, of course.
1966.
Right.
Yeah. So the church
so he had the church.
And this is from his pamphlet, a thing that he was kind of passing out to members at the time.
Right.
And this is a quote. Ritual magic is a large part of the Satanic religion. The purpose in performing a ritual is to accomplish something that, by other means, could not be done. Ritual magic is a very real power. It utilizes such tools as hypnosis, telepathy, psychology, etc. The type of magic practiced in the Satanic Church is similar to all primitive forms of magic that have been used successfully for centuries, but which have been brought into the contemporary world in a workable way that will relate to the society in which we live.
So that's LaVey first, kind of at the beginning of the quote, right from the outset, defines Satanism as a religion, rather than a mere, supposedly or presumably, as opposed to mere philosophy, right? So he's coming out the outset, defining Satanism as a religion, and he's saying that he's basically saying that Satanism is merely kind of
codifying it in a modern way.
Yeah, centralizing and making these ancient forms of magic accessible to the modern society. I mean, he's just modernizing.
He mentions psychology there, and he does that in the Satanic Bible. He mentions there's applied psychology.
Right.
He does mention those aspects of it, but
but there's also telepathy.
Yeah. Well, telepathy's... there's been no major scientific findings on that.
Yeah, as far as we know, telepathy is supernatural and metaphysical
now,
in nature.
I actually agree with LaVey's definition of magic so far. I mean, the idea that science can't codify it yet, I am in total agreement with that. I think it hasn't quite got there yet. I think I have seen verifiable proofs of magic. I've seen verifiable proofs of the supernatural so far in my life, time and again, and to me, it's a truth, but it's so far a subjective truth because there hasn't been an objective standard to codify it. So I'm actually in agreement with LaVey up to with all of this so far.
Right.
I mean, I think these are all real forces, So I think, another thing that kind of goes into now. So far. He's kind of a amorphous force. There hasn't been a personal identity to it. There hasn't been any kind of theistic so far. It's kind of a pantheistic idea or deistic, although we're not using strict definition of deism.
Right.
But there is a deistic idea. He does say in the Satanic Bible, Satan's not concerned with, or God, by any definition, is not concerned with humans on this ball of dirt.
We're certainly arriving in an area of the definition of Satanism that it's pantheistic, which or
at least LaVey is pantheistic.
Right, which is not in conflict with atheism, actually.
It's not in conflict with atheism. You can
so
still,
as long as we don't define any particular deities or anthropomorphic forms, then we're safe as atheists.
Okay, so I mean, let's venture.
But again, let's not conflate atheism with secularism. It's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's get into. Actually, this is a soundbite from LaVey. This is one of his last interviews that he did. I want to play a quick soundbite for you guys because now he's talking about demons. He mentions the word demons he mentions the word forces or something along those lines. And I want to play that soundbite really quick, and then I want to read a quote from the Satanic Rituals and the Satanic Bible and kind of add to that quote. But let's listen to this really quickly.
Okay, let's give it a shot.
Well, when I was a teenager, I was interested in the occult. And the occult in those days meant you got dream books and you got books on fortune telling and all that sort of thing. And the closest thing there was to anything about calling up spirits or demons and that sort of thing was a lot of gobbledygook where you stood around in a circle and you used the protective names of Jehovah and Jesus and all that. And I tried it. Oh, Lord knows I tried it, but it didn't work. And so I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to call up any demons, if I'm going to get any magical power, if I'm going to get anything going my way, I better get on the side of those guys instead of protecting myself from them.
So
on the side of those guys. Of what guys, LaVey? Well, on the side of these dark forces to have my will.
Now, do you think there's room? No, but do you think there's room for metaphor with that, though? Or do you think he was pretty certain on, identifying?
Yeah, I don't think.
Do you think? Okay, so he's codifying these forces as demons, so like individual.
So it starts to get
conscious entities. Do you
right.
think? So let me read from a quote from the Satanic Bible again, and this kind of goes into that idea too. So listen to this. This was from the Some Evidence of a New Satanic Age section chapter. During white magical ceremonies, the practitioners stand within a pentagram to protect themselves from the evil, quote-unquote, forces which they call upon for help. To the Satanists, it seems a bit two-faced to call on these forces for help, while at the same time protecting yourself from the very powers you have asked for assistance. The Satanist realizes that only by putting himself in league with these forces can he fully and unhypocritically utilize the powers of darkness to his advantage, to his best advantage.
Yeah, I don't think he's being metaphorical here. I think he's speaking literally about dark forces in nature and calling upon them to do his bidding in the real world. And
so almost codifying them as entities, rather.
Right, and so that,
so then it's not an amorphous.
Now it's not. It moves away from pantheism and becomes more theistic. Actually, at that point,
I don't want to go that far.
I'm not saying it is theistic. I'm saying it's moving towards a theistic. Once you start identifying specific deities or demons, we're moving away from a general force of nature, and we're getting more towards specific entities that we're calling upon.
Okay, and I want to do another one. This is one more from. This is actually from the Satanic Rituals part. This is his second book he released, I believe, in 1972. And he's addressing, this is the first part where he says, concerning the rituals. As to the pronunciation of the names involved, despite some occultists who insist you can't expect help from the forces you call upon if you can't pronounce their names right, assume that the forces, demons, or elementals have enough insight to judge a caller's worthiness on more profound criteria than his glib tongue or expensive shoes.
Oh.
He goes on to say, pronounce it how it sounds natural to you and things like that, but...
It's nice to know they don't care that I'm wearing some beat-up Nikes or something.
I wouldn't go into I wouldn't go in a ritual chamber with, I guess some sandals could be good. I was about to say sandals, but I guess some sandals could be cool.
But it turns out they wouldn't mind if you did, apparently.
Not at all. Or if I'm doing it well. I would.
Yeah.
I like to feel that, I like to put some emphasis on speech.
Sure.
So I'd like to think I did a good job.
Right.
But they don't mind.
Apparently, yeah, right. And so Now what we have are forces or deities or demons making basically judgment calls about, hey, these things don't matter. What this, the way you say my name is really insignificant, is secondary. I don't care so much about that as much as I care just about the content and the emotional dedication to the...
Yeah, I mean, so there's
now
individual consciousness. Now, do you think to say any of this is a metaphor is a stretch at this point?
I think that would be a stretch to say that any of this is metaphor. I mean...
yeah, I mean, this is multiple kind of...
And what purpose, what purpose would LaVey have calling this thing metaphor? He's pounding it in over and over. I mean, it sure seems literal.
Yeah, so we have Satan as a force, Satan as a force that can be called upon using conscious directive. He talks about demonic forces in
multiple demons. Yeah, I mean, demons is plural.
With S, there's an S at the end. Right. So now there are those who say, Satanism as a philosophy. I don't really see Satanism as a religion. It's an anti-religion. I don't really see it as a religion. I see it as a philosophy. I mean, what say you on that? I mean, there's tons that will say it is a religion. I mean,
right.
And LaVey himself, and I'll get a bit into that, and we'll finish up the quotes, I promise. But
sure.
We'll get one quote about religion. But I mean, when you have supernatural elements, what do you feel religion requires? I mean, as a secular atheist, what would you say?
Well, of course, from a secular standpoint...
Maybe I just stepped off the cliff with asking this question. You would say it requires regression. But, I mean, what would you say religion requires?
Right. So what defines a religion against a mere philosophy? Well, from a secular standpoint, of course, mere philosophy is not going to call upon supernatural forces, is not going to call upon, an invocation of dark forces,
so you're saying
of demons.
There's spiritual elements. Now I have to say
mystical spiritual elements.
I mean, LaVey countered the idea of using the word spiritual, though. He called the supernatural supernormal.
Yeah, well,
he says it's science that hasn't been discovered yet.
Well, these are all fun plays on words, and I'll allow LaVey to do that. But really what he's saying, if he wants to call supernatural supernormal, that's fine. But in essence, it's still supernatural. We're still calling upon dark forces and demons and things that in the secular world don't exist, really.
Okay, so this is for sure... religion.
So, right.
I mean, this is a religion.
And that is the distinction. For me, from a secular perspective, the distinction is from mere philosophy, a religion has to have supernatural, mystical elements,
Okay. All right. So let's go into a LaVey quote. This is from the Satanic Bible. Once again, Some Evidence of a New Satanic Age. In that chapter, he goes in describing Satanism as a religion. So, Satanism is based on a very sound philosophy, says the Emancipated. So he's actually quoting, he's doing like a non-existent quote, kind of. So Satanism is based on a very sound philosophy, says the Emancipated. But why call it Satanism? Why not call it something like Humanism, or a name that would have had connotation of a witchcraft group, something a little more esoteric, something less blatant? And this is him. There is more than one reason for this. Humanism is not a religion. It is simply a way of life with no ceremony or dogma. Satanism has both ceremony and dogma. Dogma, as will be explained, is necessary. And he goes on to explain that it's necessary. Psychology at that time, applied psychology, says that you need dogma. That's in quote there, obviously. But
sure.
That you need dogma, that you need to have the ceremony, you need to have ritualization. But he describes it as a religion because of those things. And remember in the previous quote, he says ritual magic is a large part of the satanic religion.
Yep.
And again, in Some Evidence of a New Satanic Age, that same chapter, he says this quick little bite. Satanism is the only religion known to man that accepts man as he is and promotes the rationale of turning a bad thing into a good thing rather than bending over backwards to eliminate the bad thing. So he's pushing the philosophy of self-deification, of not having sin. He's criticizing most spiritual religions. But he describes Satanism as a religion. So the whole, Satan philosophy, not religion, I mean, so far it does have religious elements. Even to LaVey, it has religious elements. So it is a religion. I mean, clearly.
I would say so, yeah. We're not going to... we're not going to separate LaVeyan Satanism from the intrinsic mysticism and supernatural elements that exist within it. You'd have to cut the book in half to get rid of all of the rituals and satanic magic that go on in the Satanic Bible.
Book of Belial and the Book of
So
Leviathan.
to call it merely a philosophy, I think is a misnomer, for sure.
If you call it merely a philosophy.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
for sure.
it certainly includes philosophy, but it also includes all of this mysticism and supernatural stuff and ritual and calling upon dark forces to affect reality.
Yeah.
That's not mere philosophy. That goes beyond philosophy, and now we're getting into religiosity and we're getting into supernatural. Yep.
Okay. So, Matt, I mean, from your perspective, considering everything we just went over, let's break it down. I mean, secular versus mystical. Is LaVeyan Satanism, although it has secularist views towards establishment, I mean, LaVey, in The Devil's Notebook, Pentagonal Revisionism, he talks about taxation of all churches. So he's critical of how religions have existed in the past.
That's great. That's good.
So it may be secularist in a fashion, but is LaVeyan Satanism secular?
No, absolutely not. Not from my point of view. So to be secular, you essentially need to be non-spiritual. You need to denounce things which are not supported by evidence, basically from a scientific perspective.
Objectivism.
Yeah, right. You need to be able to carry out experiments reliably that show that magical practice is actually affecting
reality in an objective way.
In an objective way, right.
So to say that it's science that hasn't been invented yet, I mean, because that's one of the main things. So, I mean, one of the main parts of magic and LaVeyan Satanism, it's science that is yet to be proven. Science and religion both have not come up with a way to fully codify this. So you say that calling it science, not spiritual, it's science that hasn't been proven. I mean, what's your call on that?
Well, again, going back to episode 1, I think it may very well be the case that elements of magic are indeed a form of science which has yet to surface, to be scientifically recognized. But that simply has not been the case yet. It's simply the case that, magic and mysticism are things that are not objectively defined, they're not objectively recognized, and until they are, it's just kind of a silly thing to say. It's just science. It's not science yet.
Well, I don't know about silly.
I mean,
it's just kind of.
It's an assertion. It's a presumptive assertion that doesn't have a leg to stand on. Not to say it has not a leg to stand on is a bit much. I mean, because you have, like I said, in my own personal experience, I've seen things happen. I'll call it subjective experience because it's me. It's my personal experience. Right.
It's not easily codified. Magic is something that you can easily codify.
But personal anecdotes do not make scientific.
Does not a science make?
Does not a scientific truism make? Yeah.
Well, okay. I agree.
Fair enough.
I agree that each one has its place. I agree. But.
And I'm not, and don't get me wrong, I'm not in a position, I don't want to go around and deny people of their subjective experiences. That's not what I'm...
Yeah, we tackled that already.
That's not what I just want to reiterate that point from episode 1 as well. But we also cannot, we cannot call these things secular, and we cannot call them scientific just yet. Maybe
if you're using an objectivist view, you cannot.
Yep.
No way.
And I'm happy to make room for the possibility, but let's not jump ahead of ourselves and say that they are science that is just not science yet. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Well, I think it disagrees with objectivism. I think it disagrees with a solid secular objectivism.
It absolutely does.
So there's also this idea of an intellectual decompression chamber, and LaVey talks about this in the Satanic Bible. It's the idea that you go in, but he more talks about it to maximize the ability of magic. We have a rational thought. In a modern world, we have rational thought. We think magic may not exist. I mean, we have this idea that it's fantastical. So he talks about the intellectual decompression chamber.
Right.
Like when you go into the ritual room, you suspend disbelief
It's more
that
like
moment.
It's more like an intellectual suppression chamber from my view.
No, come on.
Sorry.
I think there's truth to it. I think because there's a bit of play that goes on with ritual. You want to manifest these forces that you're trying to do. So if you're trying to do a certain type of magic or sorcery, what have you, you want to visualize it. You want to not doubt yourself. You don't want to doubt the image of what you're trying to make happen. It has to be real to you. Right. So there's the intellectual decompression chamber. So for that moment, we actually believe in that, or we put ourselves in a mode. We suspend our disbelief.
Yes, exactly.
What is that?
Yeah. Well,
does that allow room for is that secular?
No, it's not secular. Again,
so you can't be secular, objectivist, secular.
No, absolutely not. Because what you're asserting with something like the intellectual decompression chamber is what you're really saying is that, well, sometimes I believe in magic, but most of the time I don't. Most of the time.
But if you're trying to make a change,
most of the time,
I mean, but if you're
most of the time I actually disbelieve it. But when I'm in the intellectual decompression chamber, now I'm in my suspension of disbelief. And then I think it's real. I mean, is this not a direct contradiction and oxymoron of it's like splitting your personality in two?
I think the kicker is this. If you're trying to change the world in a meaningful way outside of scientific objectivism, one, you can't call yourself objectivist, at least a total objectivist, or secular, if you think it's going to have a change in the world. I mean, that's the kicker. So you go to the ritual chamber.
Okay, so a change in attitude... A change in subjective attitude can certainly have an objective change in the world around you, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is...
It's good to draw that comparison.
Yeah,
you can have
there are some kinds of subjective...
Absolutely.
Experiences that can have an objective change in the world.
I mean, applied psychology, doing a ritual may boost up your psychology, your psychological profile.
Right, and some I think would make a psychodrama argument for satanic rituals,
yeah.
but you know, given the quotes that we've seen and the discussion we've had so far,
we're not talking about just.
I think we've ruled out. I think we've ruled out the possibility that satanic rituals are mere psychodrama.
Mere as in there is nothing extra happening that can be explained.
So in other words,
there's explained benefits. There's explained benefits to a psychodrama, or at least can be studied.
Maybe an enhanced self-esteem.
I get a thing to get a new job. I get self-esteem. Right. I run in there with confidence. That works. But things as in
these dark forces we're calling upon to affect changes in reality.
Putting a curse on somebody in China, across the world, and then a couple of weeks later. Something happens to them. I'm affecting on the other side. I mean, something that you just can't.
And that's the kind of assertion. Yeah.
In today's science,
maybe in tomorrow, maybe in tomorrow's, but
but we're talking. This is outside of just immediate secular experience,
right? So
the psychodrama part, you don't buy in. You're saying buy into it as in you don't believe that.
Well, and again, that's not my circle, but from my point of view as an outsider, as a secularist, and given my understanding of what Satanism is, and according to our quotes and definitions, I don't see how we can get away with calling satanic rituals in accord with LaVey and the Satanic Bible mere psychodrama. I think there's
a bit more going on.
The assertion is that there's more to it than that.
Absolutely,
we're calling upon dark forces.
I think there's more going on too.
Yeah.
I personally, like I said, through experience, I've experienced it, so I'm totally with it. I'm totally with LaVey up to this point, and at least in these regards. Now, is Satanism secular humanism? Because there's been this term that's thrown around, like Satanism is secular humanism, and I want to dig into that.
Right.
So let's go ahead and look at. I mean, how do we define humanism?
Well, first of all, let's deal with the secular part of secular humanism, and I think we've already pretty well.
Is it
made? I think I've made my argument at least that
I kind of agree. You can have secularist in philosophy. In some regards, but is it secular as a whole? No.
Satanism is not secular as a whole.
No, absolutely not. I don't think so. I mean, if you believe in magic, and actually, let's go back to those statistics.
Oh, sure.
James R. Lewis. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Right, the sociologist.
Yeah, so this is a sociologist, James R. Lewis, did a study. He did a pool. He sent out questionnaires to a group of individuals who identified as Satanists.
Right.
And what they found is a total of about 36% of them were either theistic or saw Satanism as a force. This is in 2001. 36%.
So either theistic or at least atheistic or pantheistic.
Pantheistic.
Sorry. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And it's more about I think it's 10 to 12% or 15% were theistic. The other 20% or so saw Satan as like a force, possible pantheism.
More pantheistic, right?
Yeah, and 88% believed in magic. 88%. So
wow.
I mean, whether you want to call magic esoteric, and as a whole, Satanism esoteric,
right?
You can't take out the magic part. I mean,
you
magic
you can't take out the mysticism. Yeah,
I think to remove that would be
you're gutting Satanism
and LaVey's identification
with
it.
Yeah.
So you have that, and then he goes on in his second study. I mean, and he released a book called The Devil's Demographics in 2010, 2011. And he took from all three of his surveys that he did with Satanists from his pool, this study, he wrote kind of a sum up of the changes in the Satanic milieu. And he wrote that, still influenced by LaVey, they still look like they're influenced by LaVey. This seems to be an undercurrent with Satanists now in 2010, 2011. However, there seems to be a far greater amount of Satanists that subscribe to esoteric and theistic. He said far greater amount.
From 2001 to 2010.
From 2001 to 2011.
So the mysticism is gaining popularity in the Satanic community, in other words. Over the course of that 9 or 10 years.
So to remove magic from Satanism, at least subscribing to LaVey.
Right.
At least subscribing to LaVey as the central figure. To remove magic, I mean, at least in LaVey's definition, magic was a very important part of the Satanic religion.
That's my read of it as well.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible for Satanism, for LaVeyan Satanism, to be secular.
Okay.
But
so what about the humanism? Now it talks about celebration of human life, celebration of the self,
right.
Self-deification again. So is
Satanism and there's
humanism.
a pretty good degree of selfishness in Satanism as well. I mean,
absolutely,
being firstly concerned with one's own well-being and one's own prosperity and well-doing.
Well, of course, absolutely.
So,
I mean,
right.
do you have a definition of humanism on hand that we could?
I have a definition of humanism from the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without theism and other supernatural beliefs, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspires to the greater good of humanity. So, given that definition of humanism...
Well, progressive has to come to challenge. Although there is LaVeyan Satanists who identify with progressive attitudes politically. I don't know if progressive would be an accurate word, but we could keep that. Without theism, okay, you don't necessarily have to be theistic.
You don't necessarily have to be theistic be a Satanist,
okay.
but you...
And other supernatural beliefs.
Right, but you do have to have those, unfortunately, as a LaVeyan Satanist. So right there, I think that basically stops it there. But let's continue. So affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment. Okay, I don't see any conflict there.
Absolutely.
That aspires to the greater good of humanity. So that's a necessary attribute of humanism, which I don't think is
Satanic.
Yeah, it's not a necessary. Not a necessary attribute of Satanism. I mean, it's not in conflict with Satanism, but it's not. Where Satanism is more concerned with the self and selfishness and personal gain.
I mean, well, there's the idea of Ayn Randian objectivism, lax talionis, eye for an eye, social Darwinism, selective breeding, as in finding the most intelligent, the most able. When one man smites you on one cheek, smash him on the other.
Right.
Retributive justice. Casting out curses, spells of destruction.
Right. So
well, I mean, there is things in the Satanic Bible and in LaVeyan's philosophy that do talk about humans need to be emancipated from these external gods. He does talk about the secularist view. So in that idea, I guess it's humanistic if you view those views as being humanistic. But if you kind of have this idea of lex talionis, eye for an eye, do you think that runs in line with humanism? I think it's a bit shaky.
No,
I think it's a bit shaky.
I disagree. I think there's nothing humanistic about Satanism.
I think now to say there's nothing humanistic, I think there's things that are humanistic about Satanism.
Okay, but
it's just not humanism as a whole.
You can't call Satanism as a whole humanistic or
humanism.
A subset of humanism. Yeah, no.
I think there's humanistic aspects to it.
Sure,
but Randian objectivism, sure. As I understand it,
yeah, an eye for an eye, and
sure, all that jazz.
Yeah, we're not aspiring to the greater good of humanity. Now, well, I guess some people could argue that point. I mean, some people might say something like, "Well, eye for an eye actually does lead to the greater good of humanity." I mean, okay, I guess that may be the case, but humanism, as defined again by the American Humanist Association, you've got to do without your supernatural beliefs, and that's not something you can do with Satanism.
So at least that one tenet for sure
is a definite blocker.
Okay.
Yep.
So not secular humanism.
It's definitely not secular, and from my view of things, I would say it's definitely not humanism as well.
Not in total humanism, at least in my view. Not as a whole. It's humanistic in
it may have humanistic elements.
Sure.
But it's not humanism. Satanism is not human. It may have humanistic elements, but it is not a subset of humanism.
Okay, so considering everything, I think it begs the question. Let's get down to the ground, to the bedrock of things, to quote LaVey. Let's get down to the bedrock. And let's figure out, let's define, what is atheistic Satanism? I mean, can it be atheistic by definition? LaVey was talking about forces. There was some form of mysticism. There was some form of what can be construed as a form of pantheism. So by technical definition, I mean, let's atheism, as I understand it, it means most Satanists kind of eschew certain mysticism and things like that. But I think by strict definition,
from my read of things and the definition of atheism, there's no necessary conflict between Satanism and atheism.
Yeah, so I mean, you can have mysticism. And
you can still have mysticism and supernatural beliefs and the belief that your magic is affecting change in the real world and still be an atheist. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no conflict there.
And I think it's a bit shaky, but the pantheist idea, it's not traditional pantheism, but there's the pantheist ideals of LaVey, talking about forces have, you can consciously call upon them and change things. So when you say atheistic Satanism, at least if you subscribe to LaVey's canon, you kind of mean pantheistic, or at least quote-unquote potential pantheistic.
Right. I would say that with regard to Satanism, pantheistic Satanism is the same thing as atheistic Satanism.
As in the views of LaVey were pantheistic, at least in some way.
Absolutely.
It could be understood to be that way. So by technical definition, Satanism can be atheistic. I mean, let's look in the other side of things. And so another point on that mysticism, though, like I said, I've known some chaos magicians. I've known a lot of atheists who do believe in like spirits and things like that. So there is room for that. There's room for a lot of people in the occult consider themselves atheists or call themselves atheists. So again, let's go on the other side of things. Satanism does not necessarily prohibit a central deity. Well, when I first read the Satanic Bible, when I was first going through it, I had the idea that it's a force. You can kind of define it by whatever means you want, to quote that God part. God, by whatever means, is not concerned with, humans on a little ball of dirt, and to quote that. But I had the idea you can kind of define Satan the way you want, but you just don't subvert yourself to him or her, what have you, to it. You don't genuflect, to kind of quote LaVey also. You don't subvert yourself to this deity. You are the highest form of human life. You worship oneself. But it doesn't necessarily mean you can't have a belief in forces or spirits or entities or even deities per se, like you kind of have a choice with that. I mean, that's how I interpret it. And looking over it now, I still kind of feel the same way. I mean, it kind of feels like you had the room for that, but ethically, by satanic ethos, you just couldn't kind of worship, give oneself to being below this entity. It's not above you in a moralistic, ethical power sense. You are the highest form of life. So, I mean, so you don't have to be atheistic per se. You can believe in deities, it seems like. I mean, if we understand forces or demons as things now, it seems like there's a potential for it.
So there is a space in which Satanism can be atheistic, but I think what we're saying is that Satanism is not necessarily atheistic. There's also room for deities and anthropomorphic versions of Satan and devil worship. There's room for that in Satanism, at least.
I think if you get to the LaVey canon, I don't know. Devil worship is a very strong word. There's a lot of connotations that come with that. I think there is an idea of self-deification. You are your own god. Your birthday is the highest celebration. So if you subscribe to LaVey canon, it would be a stretch to say you can completely subvert yourself to a deity. I think you can believe in demons, at least according if we look at these ideas, but you kind of command them. Command the powers of darkness.
Rather than worship and grovel to them.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I see your distinction there.
So there's that. And to go back to the sociological study that was done by Lewis, you have 36% believe in Satan as either a force or a deity, theistic. They identified as theistic, meaning there is some worship in there, actually.
Theistic doesn't necessarily...
I guess you're right. That
doesn't mean worship.
You're totally right.
Yeah.
You're totally right.
All that means is
I'm saying there can be some worship in there. There
sure.
can be some...
But that's actually not what you're supposed to do as a Satanist.
It's not. No. If you're sourcing yourself from the LaVey canon, absolutely not.
Right.
And then you saw 88% in his study subscribe to magic. So that's a large amount.
Yeah, it's huge.
To kind of go back to that. And then in his later study, he said a far greater amount are subscribing to esoteric forms and theistic forms of Satanism. So it seems like that's gaining ground, at least in the community, if you were to call it a community. Mm-hmm. So let's break it down. So by technical, strict definition of atheism, Satanism is atheistic. Are we in agreement on that?
I would say that Satanism can be atheistic. There is a sense in which Satanism can be atheistic. Now, atheism has a very particular meaning that I think is sometimes conflated with what it means to be secular.
Well, I mean, that's right. You have like militant atheists that will say any mention of spiritual or any mentions of entities, they'll say it's all hogwash. All religions are the same. They're all bullshit.
Yeah, so that certainly is a colloquial understanding of what it means to be an atheist. But that is not the technical definition of what it means to be an atheist. So to be an atheist simply means that you denounce the belief in a god or in gods at all. So, but there is nothing in the definition of an atheist that says you can't believe in dark forces or supernatural forces or mystical forces or magic. So you can be, technically, by definition, an atheistic magician. And actually, that's only the sense in which you can be a Satanist, which is to be a mystic and to believe in what people in my camp would call supernatural. So this defines the narrow band in which you can be an atheistic Satanist, which is to say that you're a Satanist, and part of being a Satanist means you believe in this mystical stuff and mysticism and magic. But if you're an atheistic Satanist, all that means is you don't believe in anthropomorphic forms of gods or God or demons or Satan. So you believe in the dark forces as an atheistic Satanist, but you don't believe in an anthropomorphic form of these dark forces as an atheistic Satanist.
Yeah, and again, Satanism sourced from LaVey. So you're saying that commonly understood, as atheism is commonly understood, or colloquially understood, Satanism does not fit into atheism because of the supernatural forces, because of some forms of mysticism, because of the belief in forces or
Satanism is not compatible with the colloquial understanding of atheism because it is often conflated with what it means to be secular. Now, but however,
by strict definition,
but by strict technical definition,
it can
there's
totally be
no
atheistic.
conflict between Satanism and atheism.
Yeah, okay. And we are in agreement on that. I think as it's commonly understood, it would be very difficult to get LaVeyan Satanists. If we look at everything we've looked at, it will be very difficult to get LaVeyan Satanists in bed with secular atheists or militant atheists. I think
it's totally incompatible.
At some point,
totally
it's going to be incompatible for sure.
It's incompatible today. It's totally incompatible.
So I think that about come to terms with it. I think what we understand is that commonly understood, Satanism does not fit into atheism by technical definition. It is atheistic. By LaVeyan standards, it can totally be atheistic. There is room,
but it can be theistic too.
Otherwise. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. All right. We are artist segment of Deferred Gnosis. We have the wonderful, unflappable Romie Romak of Grypt, front woman of Grypt. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
You are actually our very first artist segment, second episode.
I'm pleased. I am honored. And thanks for choosing me.
Oh,
pleasure to have you here.
Yeah,
definitely.
We choose you. So. And when we mentioned on the first episode, the darker the better, we were not kidding around, especially with bringing Grypt on. That is definitely a truth. So getting right into it, kind of describing the music, I think of elements of psychological horror. I think of like Tales from the Dark Side. I think of Night Gallery. I think of inspiration coming from there. I also notice in your choice of covers, well-known pop artists like Lil Wayne, Beyonce, Static X. It's an interesting one for sure.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of seems at first glance that this would be kind of polar opposite to the dark underpinnings of the music. It seems maybe even a potential element of farce in these particular pieces. I was wondering if there's a deeper intention to that. Well, of course there is, but I wonder if there's a philosophical intention to those choices.
Well, I mean, there's going to be a little bit of my own kind of dark sense of humor, kind of twiddled into any choice that I make. But no, absolutely there are. Long story short, I suppose, I am a fan of the cleverness of pop music in a lot of contexts. I mean, I judge it like I would anything else. And, I think it's interesting. We're all kind of still forced in our own way to listen to the radio. Just if we go to a store or something, it's really hard to be completely.
You can't get away from it really. Entirely.
It is. It's inescapable. And I was hearing all of these songs, and I thought to myself, I wondered if I were the only person who was hearing, just how nihilistic and self-serving and how kind of creepy and just lusty and desperate and disparate like these songs really were.
Sure. And that's definitely clear with Love Me. That is, I mean, the darkness is very apparent in that particular track.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Drake and Lil Wayne, and like when I heard that one, I was always just like, this song is so creepy. All it needs is like an aesthetic nudge, just a tiny bit, and like
even
a little
Satan
bit of a dark.
Yeah,
it does. Yeah, it mentions Satan, and you just push it a little further, like just off the cliff, and it can be just this very creepy, very.
I hate that we'd have to ask
song.
The audience to listen to the tracks in order to understand what we're talking about. But if you listen to Grypt's version of it, the darkness is made more clear, and I guess that's ultimately one of the intentions or the directions of Grypt, right? To kind of put this darkness to the forefront.
Sure. I mean, I thought that we would be doing the songs sort of a I don't know, it sounds like egotistical to say we'd be doing the songs a service, but I just felt like, you know, a lot of people maybe weren't seeing what I was seeing in the songs, and that I consider doing covers like a completely different art than writing songs. So it may seem like our choice of covers is supposed to be funny or whatever, and you know, of course there's going to be an element to that, but you know, I legitimately thought all of them were good songs in their way. We did Naughty Girl by Beyonce for a Cleopatra Records compilation called Indigo's Pop. Okay. And the Love Me, Drake and Lil Wayne one was on Mabson Enterprises, Kyle Mabson's labels comp. And then we also did Push It from Static X for Mabson Enterprises new metal comp. So I do enjoy the opportunity to kind of take these songs and, I guess, like I said, make them creepier than they already were. For that particular comp, getting Static X, was that a choice dear to your heart, or was that something that was just needed in the compilation? You know, I think that I didn't want to make it a joke. I legitimately think that whole album is good. I don't care what people say. You know, there's a lot of really cool ideas on it. It has a cool sound, and I'm not just saying that for any sort of like whatever, you know, sentimental reasons. Like I heard it at the store when I was a little kid walking through Target or some other horrible place. That's probably true, but you know, I think it's good, and I don't like to do covers of songs to make fun of them. I do them because I want to do my own interpretation of the track. Excellent. Or we do, you know, it's obviously it's not all me.
So Romie, I was wondering if maybe you could just give us kind of a quick history of the band of Grypt and kind of explain to us the formation of it and kind of the ideas that maybe went into that. How it came to be, the brainchild of Grypt. What is that? Sure. Well, basically, my good friend Taylor Sheckett, sound designer behind Grypt, it started, it's just the two of us. Now it's three. Merkabah or Ichabod Strange, both aliases apply, I suppose, has joined it. Now we're a trio. But anyway, long story short, Taylor and I had been wanting to do just a project for fun, if not anything else, where we would get to experiment with a more overtly dark sound. Sure. And so we just got together for a couple of days, and we, you know, picked up whatever was lying around in Taylor's home studio, and we did a couple of songs. We wrote them really fast, and that became the first EP that we put out on Tundra Dubs, which is Brown and Orange Streaks, Terrible Fish, or actually Terrible Fish / Brown and Orange Streaks. And then we added a couple of remixes that some friends of ours did. And it went so well and it went so quickly and the sessions clicked that we thought, you know, we had something there and we wanted to do more with it. And in the song Terrible Fish, there's a lyric that says, "In a glass crypt, I pound the walls." Glass crypt being, you know, kind of a shower, more or less, was what we were hinting at. And so we thought that idea aesthetically went with what we were doing, the shower being kind of like a womb, or a crypt being like a death tomb, you know, like a beginning and an end, a place of privacy, a place where you can really explore your most internalized thoughts and feelings. And then we just called it Grypt, which was actually Taylor's idea, like a portmanteau of glass crypt. It's kind of a recreation of the self? Yeah, I suppose. I think it's just, I mean, if one of the themes that's there, it's just embracing your inner turmoil, embracing your flaws, and embracing the things that people are afraid to embrace about themselves. And that way, if you seem like an asshole and people get to know you, they'll be like pleasantly surprised later when they, you know, get your nice side. Whereas most people do the inverse of that, and then they just end up, you know, being a big disappointment. So it's very interesting and so very true. I mean, that's hugely insightful. So you mentioned kind of focusing or putting a microscope, scanning the inner turmoil, and that kind of brings me to a question. I wonder, in the vein of Grypt and its sound and its musical expression, is there any aspect of it that is reactionary? I mean, is there anything, kind of based on how you talked about playing with pop sensibilities and kind of and kind of running that through the filter of Grypt, is there an aspect of your work that is reactionary to culture, to our current philosophy? Absolutely. In any way? Absolutely. I mean, you know, tying in with what I said before, don't feel ashamed to feel bitterness or anger, or don't be ashamed to want revenge on the world for force-feeding you something that doesn't do anything for you, or, you know, feeling like you can't go anywhere and find
anything relatable to you as a person. And I felt like, having seen the beginning and the end of the Zeros, that a lot of stuff that I really detested was marketed, of course, in a mainstream sense, as being alternative or quote unquote indie. That was sort of like the word that lost its meaning in the decade of the Zeros. And, someone like a band like Mumford & Sons or like Zooey Deschanel, of course, to people who know things, they would see that as kind of like a parody of itself. However, horrifyingly enough to me, to most people, that was what was considered an alternative. And this has probably existed as a phenomenon forever.
So the point is lost on them for the most part.
Sure. And basically, to get to the point, all these bands that were making this like folky, faux indie pop music about falling in love and wearing your heart on your sleeve and, expressing problems that only very privileged people get to have be the main focus of their life. I thought not only could I not relate to it, but it made me feel just so alienated, and I wanted to do something that was very different from that, because I just don't buy that these people with their singer-songwriter music are the good, kind of virtuous, vulnerable people they make themselves out to be. They probably they're rock stars. They probably take advantage of groupies on the road and rape people or what. I don't know what they do. Who cares? Yeah. But anyway,
most likely. If we were to trust any of the legends,
sure.
If I had to place a bet,
seems like a logical thing to come to.
Sure.
Kind of a big accusation, but I'm willing to rest with it.
And there's deconstruction that is required in our time, and you're definitely the vehicle for doing that. So what is the future plans? Any shows coming up, any events, projects for Grypt?
Well, let's see. We've been busy. We are, there's a lot of things in the works, so I don't want to get too ahead of myself. We will be playing at Le Cave November, I believe the 13th, which is going to be our second Orange County show. We haven't really played much in Orange County. We mostly played in the greater Los Angeles area. So we'll be playing at Le Cave with our friends Block, and then we'll be doing more dates in November that are kind of coming down the pipeline toward confirmation. So the best way to keep up with us, especially if you want to see us live, is going to be via, the internet. Go figure, as it were. Grypt.me is our website, or you can find us, social media, Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud, Tumblr, etc. We're on Elo too, but I haven't been on that in a moment. I sort of forgot about my Elo
a few
accounts,
people
to
might
be
have
honest.
I think a few people might have made that same decision.
It happens.
So it's good. So a force of deconstruction and darkness coming straight from the heart, soul, and inner turmoil of Romie, Romak,
and bitchiness.
Right.
Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a sincere pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel the same way. Reciprocated. Back at ya.
Excellent.
Hail Satan.
Hail Satan.
Thank you for listening and lending your ears to the Deferred Gnosis podcast.
Please use the contact information in the description below. You may reach us at deferredgnosis.com. You may also find us on Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud, iTunes, etc. Or reach us by email at deferredgnosis@gmail.com.
Please send us your topic ideas, suggestions, things you might want us to discuss. Help us carve out a niche of truth, reaching some ground just on the edge of the fringe. And if you are a musician, writer, poet, artist of any kind, please feel free to send a link to your work, audio or otherwise. We'd be more than happy to plug your work and possibly interview you for the show.
But remember, we have a penchant for the subversive, so the darker, the better.
Thank you for listening.
And highest cheers from Deferred Gnosis.
Ave, hails, as above, so below. talk to my mom, recorder.
You're famous for that kind of shit.
Mom, I'm recording a podcast about Satanism.
Defining Satanism.
Secular versus atheistic Satanism. What do you think? She'll say, Shay, I don't like that stuff. That's what she'll say. Yeah. I love my mom. She's down. No, she's down for me, dude. I just can't directly talk about, like, Mom, I'm a Satanist.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just different.
Yeah.
Different era.
I think she told me I'm going to heaven anyway. She said she saw ahead and that I'm going to heaven anyway. So, win-win, dude.